Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, just a few questions to the proponent of the bill as amended.
Representative, had that prepare yourself. Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, in listening to this conversation, as we speak right now, I did hear the conversation between Representative Ackett and the good chairman, but I just want to be clear. As we speak now, how is this information available for people to get their loans forgiven? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Abbott.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I know that the federal government passed this legislation in 2007. It becomes effective in October of 2017. I really can't speak to how widely known it is amongst the folks in the general population who serve for public service organizations. We heard some public testimony from folks who actually, I think, learned through their labor union that they might be eligible, but otherwise would not have. I don't know that that's adequate in and of itself, and so we were asked to consider making sure that this information is more widely available through employers. The program itself is employer dependent. It's not the kind of work that you do for the public service loan forgiveness program. It is dependent on the kind of employer you work for, and so it makes sense to us that we should ask those employers to share the information with their employees who will be eligible beginning this fall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, as I understand this information will be shared by the employers. It'll be required, not shared, required by the employers to share it with their employees. And as far as the availability of these loans, and these loans are all only federal loans. Through you, Mr. Speaker, the loans are only federal. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Abbott.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, yes, this is a federal student loan forgiveness program that we're working to promote. It's only federal student loans. If you hold them and you've served a nonprofit organization or a government organization for 10 years and made your payments, you have the loan in good standing, then you are eligible after the 10-year period to have the remainder of your debt eliminated. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, the responsibility of the employer, that is what I'm most concerned with in this piece of legislation. So the responsibility of the employer is to just provide the information, whether it be putting it up on the bulletin board or by an email to the employers. And other than that, the employer does not have any other responsibility in going through the application, whether the person is eligible, non-eligible. All of those criteria is not in the purview of the employer. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hatton.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I think that's correct. Yeah, we require employers in public service organizations to provide a fact sheet, some frequently asked questions about the programs, and to have applications available upon request by an employee, but they are not required to help an employee determine whether or not they are available. They're oftentimes not privy to the kinds of student loans that their employees might have, so that will still be a responsibility of the employee, not the employer, but the employee will be advantaged by having the information in their hands. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, if the employer fails to provide this information to the employee, and will there be any repercussions on the employer? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hatton.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the bill does not provide for any repercussions other than a letter from the OHE, from the Office of Higher Education, asking them to comply in the future, which I would deem to be a corrective action.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, so that letter that will come from the Office of Higher Education, how would that letter be generated? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hatton.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I would imagine that upon a complaint that an employer is not meeting the notice requirements that are outlined in the bill, the Office of Higher Education would seek to determine whether or not the employer has complied. If they determine they have not complied, then they would I think, probably resend all of the information that they're required to give to their employees and notify them of their requirements under the bill. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, so when a complaint is made by an employee because the employer failed to give the necessary information either by a sign on the bulletin board or an email, when the employee files a complaint with the Office of Higher Ed, the Office of Higher Ed then sends a letter to the employer telling them that this is one of the things they were supposed to do, but they did not do. But in that scenario, which is what I'm concerned about in this bill, will the employer be held liable in any form? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Haddad.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, no.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, now wearing the employee's hat, who was not informed by the employer and filed the complaint, what happens to that employee at the end? Because if there's no fine to the employer, what is the gain as far as the employee is concerned? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Haddad.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure I understand the question. If he could repeat it.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Srinivasan, could you restate or reassess your question to the representative?
I definitely will. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, I will. So when the employee has not been informed of such a loan forgiveness program, finds about it through a friend in a casual setting, files a complaint to the Office of Higher Education. The Office of Higher Education obviously sends a letter to the employer saying they did not comply, they should have done this, that, or the other. I get that part, you made that very clear, and I want to thank you for that, that there's no repercussions as far as the employer is concerned. But since the employee was not made aware of such a program, perhaps lost the opportunity of getting that loan forgiveness because it was not brought to their attention by the employer, would that employee then be in a situation that could file some complaint or a lawsuit or take it to some higher level against the employer? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Haddad.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that the bill addresses that concern directly. I think that what this bill does is attempts to share information about a publicly adopted loan forgiveness program run by the federal government that it itself is trying to promote. I think that we are trying to promote it as well through the efforts of this legislation. I'm not an attorney. I don't know if, frankly, if failure of an employee to become aware of a program would be grounds for a lawsuit. I suspect not. But I think that what we're trying to do is to prevent that circumstance so that the employee can take advantage of the loan forgiveness program as soon as they're eligible. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that is where I find that this bill is deficient in. It is a great concept, no question about that at all, that people should be aware of the availability of such loan forgiveness programs. But I think to require the employer to be responsible to give that information to the employees, and then not knowing if that information is not given to the employee, what impact it could have on the employer is the part of the bill. Since it doesn't address that, I find that it is lacking in. I do agree, it's a good first step, but I'm very concerned, Mr. Speaker, that since it does not address the fact if an employer either is not aware of it or chooses not to comply, the repercussions on the employer is my big concern with this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.